In this unit, we will introduce syllogisms, learn what they are, and how to identify them. In the next unit, we'll learn the terms that we need and the rules that we will need in order to systematically evaluate syllogisms. Syllogisms are kind of an early form of logic that was developed by Aristotle, and it's going to be something very useful for us to learn, because even though syllogisms and the syllogistic logic cannot capture everything that we need in a logic, it really does capture very much of some of the basic inferences that we make in everyday life, and it's just a very useful logical tool to have. And you'll see why as we go along. So a syllogism is an argument consisting of three categorical propositions. We already discussed the four types of categorical propositions, and we did that precisely to prepare the way for learning about syllogisms. The argument consists of three categorical propositions, and as we know, since every proposition has to have one conclusion and a premise, syllogisms always have two premises and a conclusion. Of the two premises, one of them is called the major premise and the other one is called the minor premise. The major premise is the premise that contains the term and the predicate of the conclusion, and the minor premise is the premise that contains the term and the subject of the conclusion. So again, the conclusion must be a proposition, and every proposition, as we already learned, has a subject and a predicate. So here's an example of a syllogism. All German cars are well designed. Volvos are German cars, so Volvos are well designed, right? If you recall from our four types of categorical propositions, each one of these propositions is of the affirmative universal type, right? Okay, so our question now is, which one is the major premise and which one is the minor premise? Remember, the major premise is the premise that contains the term and the predicate of the conclusion. And the minor premise is the premise that contains the term which is the subject of the conclusion. So we're just going to look at the conclusion there. Volvos are well designed, and we'll have to ask which one is the subject term and which one is the predicate term. Volvos, of course, is the subject and well designed is the predicate. So when we ask ourselves what the major premise is, we just ask which one of those premises contains the term which is the predicate of the conclusion. Which one of those premises contains the term well designed? And clearly it's the first one. All German cars are well designed. So we will put that one in red here to indicate that that's the major premise. The other premise will be the minor premise in blue. And we can see how that matches up with our definition of major premise and minor premise. Yeah? So we see that well designed is the predicate of the conclusion here. And since that term is contained in the first premise, that premise on the top there is the major premise. Okay. That's simple enough. And we really just want to get situated with the idea of, the premises containing the terms which are in the conclusion. Okay. Now, syllogisms, as we said, syllogisms are very useful for everyday inferences. Yeah, that is because many of the inferences that we make in everyday life are syllogistic, right? But that doesn't mean that they are expressed in the standard form of the syllogism. So we can compare this passage, right? Take a minute to read it. Advertising aimed at children is unethical because children are defenseless against it. Such advertising preys upon ignorance and gullibility. This can be tolerated when directed against adults because they are able to protect themselves. But children do not have that capability. They are vulnerable to the message, and to exploit that defenselessness is clearly unethical behavior. So obviously there's an argument here. Yeah? In fact, it's a syllogistic argument, right? But it's not given in that standard form, and this we will call the standard form of a syllogism, where it's very clear which two are the premises and which is the conclusion, right? No, this is the way we usually encounter arguments in life, either written or spoken, right? And so to actually use logic and use their critical thinking skills effectively, we need to be able to see the argument, where it appears in the expression, in the language which is expressed, which is almost always not in standard form. So how are we going to do that? Well, recall before when we looked for arguments, right? We were looking for a conclusion, right? Every argument has a conclusion and premises. So whenever we encounter something that seems to be like an argument, what we need to do is ask ourselves, what is the conclusion? What is it that we are being told to believe or given reason to believe? Okay. Take a look at that again and think about it for a second or a few seconds or several seconds. Okay. If you think that the conclusion of this argument is that advertising aimed at children is unethical, then I think you'll be right. So we will put that in red here to indicate that that's the conclusion, right? And we will need to look at for the key statements that give us the reasons to believe it, or the reasons that it's true. And those are here, right? Children are defenseless against it. Yeah. Right. So we have advertising aimed at children is unethical because children are defenseless against it. I mean, that's the word because is a clear giveaway that tells us here's the cause. So therefore there's a premise, right? Children are defenseless against it. That is the reason why, or part of the reason why advertising aimed at children is unethical. Such advertising preys upon ignorance and gullibility. This can be tolerated when directed against adults because they are able to protect themselves, but children do not have that capability. So here what we have is basically a backup or explanation and support for that premise, right? To help us understand why children are defenseless against the advertising. Yeah. And that's because, right, they are ignorant and gullible, right? And don't have the intellectual capabilities normally that adults normally have, right, to defend themselves against the advertising, right, which preys upon the ignorance and gullibility, as it says here. So, yeah, that explains and sort of supports that key statement there. Yeah. Okay. They are vulnerable to the message, which is again kind of a restatement of that key message. But then it says, and to exploit that defenselessness is clearly unethical behavior, right? So we have two key points that work together, and this is a linked argument, if you recall from our diagramming arguments, because the fact that children are defenseless against advertising aimed at them, yeah, is not by itself a reason to believe it's unethical, but to conclude that it's unethical because they are defenseless against it, it basically implies, or let's say presumes, that exploiting that defenselessness is unethical, right? So that's another key premise. It's only together with the premise that exploiting the defenseless is unethical that it follows that it's unethical, that advertising aimed at children is unethical because of children being defenseless against it. So these two things, only when combined together, provide a reason for believing the conclusion, right? And of course, so that's why they're linked. It's a linked argument, right? That's what a linked argument was. But of course, all the syllogisms are linked arguments, actually. Yeah. And so the next step is for us to see how this is a syllogism. All right. Okay, so our first premise was that children are defenseless against advertising aimed at them, right? And this is really a categorical proposition, yeah, of the universal affirmative type that we one of the four types you already learned about, right? And we could state it this way: all advertising aimed at children is the exploitation of the defenseless. So this is of the form all S is P, right? The subject here is advertising aimed at children, and the predicate is exploitation of the defenseless. All advertising aimed at children is exploitation of the defenseless. To exploit that defenselessness is clearly unethical behavior. That was our second premise, right? Our second key statement from that passage. And that is also a categorical proposition. And to bring that logical nature, that proposition out explicitly, we would restate it in the standard form of a categorical proposition like this: all exploitation of the defenseless is unethical behavior. Right? Okay. So the conclusion is advertising aimed at children is unethical. And that is also a categorical proposition of the affirmative universal type. All advertising aimed at children is unethical behavior. Right? Okay, now you have the syllogism. All exploitation of the defenseless is unethical. All advertising aimed at children is exploitation of the defenseless. Therefore, all advertising aimed at children is unethical behavior. This is a syllogism and it's valid, right? Whether it's sound or not is another question. That is to say, are the premises true? Well, that's a different question, but we're here interested in the form of the argument and the validity, right? So this is an example of a syllogism, a properly constructed syllogism that is valid. Okay. Here's a question. Can only premises be implicit? We had talked about implicit premises before. So here's an argument to that effect, or that answers that question. In a valid syllogism, the conclusion is implied by the logical structure of the premises, and anything which is implied by the logical structure of what is explicitly stated can be left implicit. So that's your clue. That should give you the answer to the question whether only premises can be implicit. And I'll let you arrive at that answer on your own. You can fish for that one. Well, I hope you enjoyed learning about syllogisms, and I invite you and encourage you to the next unit in which we will learn how to systematically evaluate whether the syllogism in front of you is valid or invalid.